strategies for taking the FE. My name is Karen Butler. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering at Texas A&M University, and I took what was formerly the EIT during my last semester of my undergraduate work, and then went on to get a master's, worked for a year and a half in industry, went on back to get a PhD, and then after a year working at the university, applied for the professional engineer's license and took the exam in '95 and have been licensed since then. So today I want to kind of discuss some strategies for taking the FE kind of, I guess, comprehensive So the topics that I wish to discuss today will deal with kind of the format of the exam, some of the new subjects that have been included in the exam, the discipline-specific or the general discipline-specific exam, and the choice that you'll have to make, kind of getting your mind together through studying, your body prepared to endure the exam, and then a little summary of preparation, and then on to really the exam, the process, the exam itself, and a summary of some test day things. In looking at the format of the exam, the exam is basically divided into two sessions, a morning exam and an afternoon exam. And the morning exam basically addresses the general subject areas covered in lower division courses, kind of your freshman and sophomore level courses. Then in the afternoon, the concepts are more upper division levels, junior, senior types of classes, and you have a choice of one of 6 discipline-specific exams. And those are chemical, civil, electrical, industrial, mechanical, or a general exam. And that general exam is actually intended for those engineers who do not fall in any of the 5 specific disciplines. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. The exam has always kind of covered topics in electrical engineering, mechanical, and civil, but over the past few years there's also been 2 new subjects added, one being in the area of engineering ethics, and the basic points in the engineering ethic have to do with the categories of the engineer's obligations to society, employers, and fellow engineers. And these questions are actually based upon 2 pages that we'll discuss later, and so in order to make the questions have any level of difficulty, there are usually some subtleties in the question, and so you're wanting to read them very carefully to make sure you're reading exactly what's in the question. Another area that has been included is computer engineering, and its focus is digital systems, which has to do with logic and combinational circuits, and then also kind of software questions, flowcharts, pseudocode, and spreadsheets, but no real specific questions to languages such as C or Fortran. In the afternoon session, you'll have to make a decision as to whether or not you want, which discipline-specific exam you want to take. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a general discipline-specific exam, which is pretty much similar to what had been given in the past. And it has a breadth coverage in the sense that it addresses electrical, mechanical, and civil, and then the other different areas. But there are more complex questions than the general subject areas addressed in the morning exam. And so I guess one advantage to taking that exam is that you will have already reviewed the general subjects for the morning exam, and so you just simply continue that preparation for the afternoon session, looking a little deeper into some of the areas. But also there is the discipline-specific exam, and it's more of a depth coverage, and it will cover more subject areas in your selected discipline, electrical, mechanical, or civil. And you do have the choice, even though your subject may be a discipline-specific exam that's included, you don't have to take, like say, the electrical exam. You can choose to just take the general exam. And maybe to just kind of aid you in your decision, there were some results given about the October '96 exam. This was, I think, the first time that the discipline-specific exam was offered, and there were about 17,500 test takers, and of those, 52% chose to take the general exam. And of the people taking the general exam, 83% of those passed who were first-time examinees, and it was about 67% for all the other candidates. But then if we look at the results, breaking it down into the other 5 disciplines, when we look at electrical, we see of the electrical engineers who took the general exam, 77% of those passed it. Of the ones taking the discipline-specific, 82% of those passed it. Then when we go to chemical, we see that it was actually the same percentage, those who chose to take the general or who chose to take the discipline-specific. And civil was slightly higher for the discipline-specific exam. The big difference was in industrial. Of those people taking it, only 46% who chose to take the general exam passed it, whereas the ones who chose to take a discipline-specific, 74% of those. And mechanical was pretty close. So you can see that, I guess from a statistical point of view, really only in industrial did it really matter, and so in all other cases it's really a choice. Okay, so next I kind of want to talk about preparing yourself for the examination. And probably one of the biggest areas that you want to prepare is preparing your mind, and most importantly, giving yourself the confidence to go into the test knowing that you have prepared and can answer the questions, because you have covered this material at some point in your career, and it's just really a matter of reacquainting yourself. So what we want to talk about is studying, and in particular we want to talk about, reviewing, and that could encompass study material from review books or through tapes. And in many of the study materials, well, in the books, they include, the books may include some sample exams, and I actually have here, not necessarily pushing any vendor, but this happens to be a kind of a fundamental of engineering book, which is more so geared toward the general exam, and also to the this one is more geared toward the morning general exam and then a general afternoon exam. Okay, and then there is one then that addresses the discipline specifics, and so there are sections on electrical, mechanical, chemical, and on. And as I said, there are many different people who sell review books. Usually you can find them in your bookstores on campuses or even in technical bookstores. And so that is also a good tool for you to use in addition to the tapes. In the books, there usually are sample exams, and depending upon who makes them, there may be even some old exams that have been given by NCEES. One of the very important things in studying for the exam is getting to know the reference handbook. And of course this is the reference handbook that will come after you register to take the examination, and is yours to use the entire time you're studying. You won't take this with you to the exam. The reference handbook actually gives you kind of a scope of the material that would be covered in the sections. Like, say for instance, if we went to one of the pages in the reference manual, and this happens to deal with electrical engineering, and so if we went to this section, which was RC and RL transients or whatever, it lists equations related to that topic. And one of the things that's very important about this is that it kind of defines the scope of the examination. And so if you were to look at the material that's covered there for that topic, that would kind of tell you the scope that you would expect in that area. Okay. Now, in also further getting to know that reference handbook, you'll notice that at the very beginning of the handbook, there will be a page of conversion factors, which are basically conversions between SI and non-SI units. And then if you go on to pages 3 here, which starts with mathematics, on down to page 81, these are then the pages related to the general subject areas. And then from pages 82, which begins with chemical engineering, through 108, you find the things related to the discipline specifics. So there's a chemical engineering, civil, and these are just more in-depth areas within, chemical or electrical. And then finally, another important point is page 116, which happens to be the index. And it may sound trivial, but you want to actually know the index because you need to know to what extent information is cataloged or indexed, so that if you're looking for something in the book during the examination, you would want to know how deep your knowledge of the topic would have to be to find it in the index. And so you want to go through the index and understand how it is actually set up. Okay? So that kind of takes us through the various sections of the reference handbook. And then, now that we kind of know the reference that we will have to use during the exam, we want to prepare a study schedule. And we basically want to decide how much time we have to put into studying for the exam, or how much time we need to study for the exam. And so we want to prepare a schedule that would state, how often you're going to study. Okay? And once we've kind of prepared ourselves mentally, which means that you have reviewed and feel confident, you also are wanting to, I guess at the same time, prepare your body for the exam. Very few people have the experience of taking 8-hour exam, and this is what you will be doing. You will be taking an 8-hour exam, and so you're needing to gain stamina for this exam. The exam will begin at 8 a.m. and it will last all day, 4-hour session in the morning, a break, and then another 4-hour session. So one of the things that you want to do is practice exam questions under exam conditions. Taking the sample exam at night doesn't expose you to the same conditions as 8 o'clock in the morning, where perhaps you're not a morning person and not as focused or whatever. So you want to practice under the exam conditions. And once you kind of build the stamina and are acquainted with the situation, then you want to, of course, the night before the exam, you don't want to have any exotic meals, which means you don't want to have anything that's going to have a lasting effect on you the next day. So, that is knowing your body. And also, perhaps even, from an alcohol perspective, not wanting that stimulant to continue its effect on the next day. Also, that morning of the exam, you want to have a hearty breakfast, really more so meaning something in a protein or carbohydrate type of thing, something that's going to give you energy for the day, not something that's going to make you kind of sluggish and dragging that morning of the exam. The next thing is thinking about the conditions of the room. The room will be prepared really for many test takers, as in all buildings or visitors in a building. And so it may be hot, it may be cold, or it could be in between. And so your best bet is to maybe have layered clothing, so that if it's too warm, you could take off one of your layers. If it's too cold, then you can build until you become comfortable. And probably during the day your temperature will change depending upon how you feel. Also, I wouldn't suggest that you study the night before, because as I said, it's very important to go into the exam with a high confidence level. And as inevitably will happen with Murphy, the night before you'll encounter all those things that you don't know, and then that will shake your confidence, and where you probably have prepared enough, but you just happen to run across the material that you didn't prepare for. So it's probably best to just relax the night before and let things take their course. So in summary of preparation of, I guess, mind and body, I would say use the review tapes and book or books, and then study at different times of the day so that you can get yourself accustomed to the exam conditions. Focus on the core concepts. 9 times out of 10, there won't be a question, that addresses some very obscure point in an area. Usually they're going to kind of focus on the core concepts in a particular area. Also, take the sample test and take them under exam conditions. So For instance, you're taking the AM session, then sit down in a quiet place with only your reference manual and go after the 4-hour exam. Also use the reference manual, and then the night before you want to organize everything that you're going to take to the examination, meaning your pens and pencils and things like that, but also your identification that will be required for the examination, and if you do have the slip for registration, that will be helpful, but an ID will be necessary. And so you want to get all those things together so that the next morning you're not panicking because you can't find what you need to go to the exam. Relax the night before, as I said, and then no special food or a drink the night before. Okay, so in preparation, we also kind of maybe want to talk about the exam process so that you're comfortable about that ahead of time and going in and not seeing any surprises in that perspective. So what we'll address now is the exam day, breaking that into a morning session, the lunch, and then the afternoon session. Okay, so the exam day. As I mentioned, it's going to be an 8-hour exam, 4 hours in the morning and a break for lunch, and then 4 hours in the afternoon. So one of the things that you would want to find out is the test venue. You need to find out the building location, what will be the parking situation the day of the exam, kind of how the room will be laid out. Will there be tables? Will there be individual desks? Just so you can have a feel of what kind of working space you're going to have, and so you kind of picture how you will organize your supplies and things like that. And if you're not familiar with the building or location of the examination, then it's probably good to go a few days ahead of time and make sure that you know how to get there, you know where the building is and where the parking is, so that the day of the exam you're panicky because you can't find it in time. Okay. The next thing is bringing the proper supplies to the examination. You can bring a calculator, and you want to have pencils and erasers, and then also preparing for the contingency, spare batteries, or a spare calculator. But if you bring a spare calculator, make sure it's a calculator that you're familiar with and not just something you picked up from a friend at the last minute and then have no idea how to make it work. And then the last thing I pointed out earlier, don't bring your reference manual. One will be supplied at the exam. Sometimes the examiners are, depending upon the situation, you may not be allowed to bring a lot of extra stuff to the room just because of maybe how closed it is or something like that. And so it's probably best to reduce the things that you bring there just in case that is a factor and you'll have to maybe leave some of your stuff outside unattended or something. And I think I've already talked about the temperature in the room. Okay. Next we will go into the morning session. Okay. Usually the doors open at about 7:30. So you want to arrive before 7:30. You want to arrive there and kind of be ready to go in at 7:30. The test usually begins as soon as everyone is seated after 8 o'clock. And once the exam is started, no one is allowed. And so if you happen to come after then, you'll just have to wait until the next time to take the exam. So it's important to be on time. There's usually about 10 to 15 minutes of instructions at the very beginning of the session. And then as with any kinds of bubble tests, the filling in of the answer sheet with your name and all those different types of things will take a few minutes. In that morning session, there are exactly 120 multiple choice questions, and for the most part these are unrelated questions. After the morning session ends, which will probably be around noon, depending upon how late you started, maybe a few minutes after noon, then you're usually given a break of about an hour to have lunch. And depending upon the situation, depending upon where you are, you may be able to go to some place very close by to have lunch, or you may have to bring your lunch with you. And so in any instance, you want to have lunch that's going to give you a boost for the afternoon, because you remember you've just gone through 4 hours of an examination, and somehow you need to have the energy to go through another 4 hours. So you want to keep that in mind in deciding what you eat in. If you do leave, make sure you give yourself ample time to come back, because again, if you don't make it back before they start, they won't let you in to interrupt the others. You can also bring snacks for the morning and afternoon sessions because, sometimes you're used to grabbing a little something here and there, and so 4 hours, straight without anything may be kind of strenuous for you. But just make sure that those are silent snacks so that you're not disturbing anyone else in opening them or eating them. Okay, then in the afternoon session, you have 60 multiple choice questions instead of 120, and these are more detailed questions, and they are grouped by subject areas. And many of the questions are kind of related to a common problem, where then they're divided into 2 to 10 sub-problems. So you may have one problem in the electrical engineering area, and then there may be 3 or 4 that gather around one problem description. So these are a little more in-depth. Okay, so I tried to kind of give you an idea of the process, which is basically the structure of the various sections of the exam. Next, I kind of want to go into the exam itself and talk about the breakdown of the questions, test-taking strategies, guessing, because that's always a question that we get, and then the way the scoring is, so that you can have an understanding of how that works. Okay, as we talked about in the morning session, there are 120 multiple choice questions, and each one of those questions is assigned 1 point, and the exam will last 4 hours, so you have about 2 minutes per question, which is a very short amount of time, and so you don't want to spend too much time on any one question. If you don't know the answer, then move on, and if you have time at the end of the session, then you can go back and address those. In the afternoon session, you have 60 multiple choice questions. And these questions, as I said, were grouped into related problem sets. So each one of these questions is worth 2 points. So you have the same amount of total points for each session. And now you have, again, 4 hours, so you have about 4 minutes per question. But the good thing about the afternoon session is, as I said, you have these questions kind of grouped around a problem statement. And so in reality, if you're going at a good pace, you may end up with, like 20, 25 minutes to really solve a problem set when you encounter something that's a little more difficult. Time is not as pressed as it may seem. Okay, and in each one of the sessions, you will actually be given a different exam booklet. So you'll get an exam booklet in the morning, and then in the afternoon, you'll get the one that is, you get an exam booklet in the afternoon. Now, you don't want to write in the reference handbook, because what happens is, in the morning is just a random distribution of the reference handbooks. And when we return for lunch, they will be distributed again randomly, and so you probably won't get the same one. And so if you've made some notes and scribbles in it, it could be distracting for the next person taking the exam. So you want to kind of be conscious of that. Now, if we look at maybe some details about the exams, let's look at the question breakdown for the morning exam. Remember, the morning is kind of a general coverage, and here we have 120 questions. So we see that there are, say for instance, 11 chemistry questions, and then so many computer dynamics and things like that. So this gives us a breakdown of the number of questions to expect. And then we see here, if we look at those different subject areas, then this tells us the topics that are actually covered in each of those subjects. Okay. Now, after the morning session, of course, then we go on to the afternoon session. And so in the afternoon, this is actually a breakdown of the questions in the general exam. Okay, and so we see that there are actually 60 questions, and then this is the distribution of those. And so we see the same topics as in the morning, but of course fewer questions, because this is the general exam. Now we see here again kind of a subject, the subdivision of the subjects for the various topics for the general discipline specific exam. So we see these different topics. Now, if we looked at engineering economics and we went back to the morning for engineering economics, we see annual cost, break-even analysis, benefit cost, future worth, present worth, and value and appreciation. Then in the afternoon, if we look at general, discipline specific, we see those same topics, but additionally risk analysis, rate of return analysis, and say tax considerations. So that's what we mean by the afternoon exam kind of going into somewhat more depth, even in the subject, the general exam. Okay, if we look then at at the various disciplines, which we have 5, we see the breakdown of the questions. Again, there is a total of 60 questions, and then this actually lists the different subjects that are addressed. Now, in the general exam, you only see actually kind of electric circuits, and there's a little bit of the computers. So we see that there are more in-depth questions related to electrical engineering, more in-depth topics, I should say, related to electrical engineering when you go into the discipline specifics. And I have included kind of the similar breakdown for the chemical, which is here, the civil, and then the industrial and the mechanical. So this gives you a feel for the different breakdown of the subjects on the various discipline-specific exams. So once you kind of have seen the subject areas that are available, that will help you in deciding how you want to address the exam. And so I think that leads us to test-taking techniques. Okay. Now, the first one we've talked about in preparing our mind, and that is familiarizing yourself with the reference manual. And so I just kind of keep repeating it because that is so important, because that is the only aid other than your mind that you have for the exam. And so you want to utilize that fully. Okay. But then the next thing you want to do is you want to develop a strategy beforehand, which means you want to kind of decide how you want to which questions you want to answer and in what order, so that you can be effective and not just start at the beginning and then at the end of the session, however many you've answered. So you want to develop a strategy beforehand. And so for me, as an electrical engineer, if I went to, and this is just that, copy the wrong thing. So if I went to the general morning exam, okay, where we had the 120 questions, and I'm looking through, and I know in that morning session these are the topics that are going to be addressed, and I look through those topics and I know my strength. That's what's important in identifying the strategy, is recognizing your strength and then saying that's where I'm going to start. And so I go and I know that, for instance, I would tackle the electrical circuits questions, and then I would probably then go to maybe the computer section, and then considering I think the ethics would be easy, I'd probably go there, and then maybe go to statics. But what I'm trying to do is I'm kind of prioritizing my strengths so that I know the order in which I'm going to address the questions, and I'm also in my mind keeping in mind how many questions I think I have a good chance of answering. Like, for instance, I know that I couldn't address these fluid mechanic issues because even in studying, I couldn't really say that I would be reviewing that subject. I'd actually have to learn that subject to address those questions. And so I also am being realistic and eliminating those topics that I haven't addressed in school or that I just didn't feel very comfortable with. So I kind of go through and figure out how many of the questions I think that I could successfully address here, and I'm going to add those up. Then I would look at the afternoon. So this is actually the 60 questions in the afternoon electrical engineering session. And then I'm going to go through that too, because even though I'm an electrical engineer, I don't happen to know all of those areas very well. So I would also go through those and look for my strengths. And so I would, from that also check, like, the digital systems. I'd cross out the electromagnetic theory and maybe go to the power system. So I'm, again, prioritizing the things in the order of my strengths, and then in the end deciding how many I think that I could, really answer without having to guess or doing some serious preparation. And so in going through those two, I would, in the morning, I would have my total number of questions from the morning, and then I would multiply that by 1 and then have an idea of, assuming that maybe I answered them all correct, what that could possibly give me. And then I would take my total number in the afternoon and multiply that by 2 and then come up with an amount, and then I would add those all up and figure out, okay, well, if I was able to get 100% of those correct, what kind of number would I have here? Because that lets me know if I really need to kind of expand my base, or if I can really focus on those and try to learn those very well, and then assume that I'm not going to get 100%, and then maybe say, okay, take it down to 80%, whatever is realistic, for the individual. And I want to have a strategy that would make it such that I'm successful in passing the exam. And I guess later in the presentation we'll talk about kind of what's the pass rate that you might need. Okay, so that addresses developing a strategy. So you see that you have to kind of think ahead of time in order to be efficient in doing the exam. Again, I think in developing the strategy, and then when I would take the exam, you want to work from the most familiar to least familiar subjects, and that's what we did in establishing the strategy. Okay, and again, that also kind of addresses what you would consider easy. Easy is what you know and is familiar with. And then the other thing has to do with deciding on the type of units, be it SI units or non-SI units. Currently, there will be some questions that contain only metric units, and then there will be some that actually contain both. And you can decide to solve the problem in either one of those. But eventually, the examination is going to kind of use all metric units. But right now, you have a choice. I would suggest that you actually just use SI units throughout, and then you don't have to deal with that problem of going back and forth. And we'll maybe talk a little bit about it a little later. This actually is the pages from the reference handbook that have to do with engineering ethics, and I thought I'd show that just because in developing, the strategy and deciding that you can address the ethics questions, it's important to kind of look at what it covers and realize that it's actually a very small scope. There are 2 pages, and as I said, it has to do with the engineer's responsibilities to, various people. And so if you really read those very carefully and understand them, you should be able to answer those ethic questions with no problem at all. But it's important that you look at this beforehand and understand what it's saying. Okay, another kind of an example of what we might see, I talked some about the afternoon and how we have sub-problems. So what I wanted to do was kind of show you, what I'm talking about in that sense. This is actually from a sample examination, and this was, of course, an electrical engineering type of question. And this was, say, questions 47 through 50. And so you're given this information where you're given, I guess, 2 current values, and then here's your circuit. So you have some values for your various inductors, resistors, and capacitors, and then you have some voltages also. And so they're going to ask you questions about various parameters within the circuit. So we see we have actually 4 questions related to this one circuit, and that's what I mean by there being these sub-problems. And so what would happen is I read the problem, give them the information, and I look at what they're asking me for. So like in this particular question, they want to know the impedance that's seen by this source, and so I basically combine these together, this series plus this being these 2 being in parallel. So I come up with this equivalent impedance for these 2 branches, and then combine it with this 5 ohm resistor that it's in series with, and then that is the impedance seen by the source, which is 11 at 7.15 degrees, and that is then the deselection. And so the other questions are of similar types, and so it's not necessarily that the questions become more difficult, they just all kind of address this one problem description. Then, as an example of the SI and non-SI questions, which remember I said that there would be some questions that that used only metric units, but then there would be some questions that actually had the problem and the solutions defined in SI and non-SI. So here to the left, we actually have the problem that's defined in SI units. And so you're given a force of 1,000 newtons, and then you're given this width here of the rigid box in meters. And then all of the information in the problem is defined in SI units. And then as you see, the answers are in SI units. On the same side, so you have the exact same problem, 81, the problem is defined in non-SI units. And so the force is given in pounds and the width of the box in feet. And then all of the information within the problem definition are using non-SI units. And then the answers are in non-SI units. Now something to keep in mind, don't feel like you can kind of smart the system in the sense of say, well, I'll solve the problem in SI units and then I'll convert it and then check my answer. Because what's happened is that answer A, if the answer was A, it would be the, A for 81 on the right side or the left side. But that doesn't mean that these two answers are equivalent. They're just kind of within the same range, so that the problem has the same complexity and stuff like that. So don't try to do that. Okay, so having really hopefully given you an understanding of what the questions may look like, the kind of the scope of those questions and different issues like that, I hope that you kind of can feel comfortable about the structure of the exam. And so the thing that many times people ask you, and which is a valid question, because sometimes incorrect answers are penalized and sometimes they're not. Where on this exam, it just so happens that incorrect answers are not penalized. And so really that means that there is no penalty for guessing. And so when you are at, toward the end or whatever, and you know that you won't be able to finish up, then, it's quite legitimate to guess. One thing to do might be to, not to just guess automatically, but try to see if you can use a little bit of intelligence to try to find the answer through some deductive measures, maybe by eliminating some of the answers using common sense, or looking in the reference manual and seeing if that might help guide you to select a particular answer. But of course, if all this fails, then you want to guess. And of course, at the end, maybe 10 minutes before the session is over, you don't want to leave any of the questions unanswered, and so you would probably 10 minutes before the end want to go through and then guess at all the ones that you had left blank. But I would kind of advise you to maybe make a consistent choice, and that's just increasing your probabilities of getting as many of them correct through your guessing process. Usually if you, and I guess I didn't really address this, but if you do finish the examination early, they will allow you to leave, but typically there is a window, I don't know, it could be 15 minutes or so, that if you finish within that last amount of time before the break, they won't let you leave, because that's pretty disruptive for the people taking the exam, because now they're stressed, there's only 15 minutes left, and then all these people are walking out. So usually if you're there at that point, you just have to stay until they call the session to an end. And typically also you are allowed to leave to go to the restroom and stuff like that, but it's probably going to be done in an orderly fashion so that everybody doesn't kind of gather together outside. So another suggestion that I might want to make is, if you know that you kind of have some sensitivities from maybe allergies or just different things like that, you might want to make sure that you bring tissue and stuff like that, because you don't want to have to lose some of your time leaving the examination to go out, to get tissue and stuff like that. And I've seen it happen, and sometimes you may have to wait 15 or 20 minutes before it's your turn to go outside. Okay, just to kind of recap, so this will kind of maybe put the last point to our whole idea of establishing a strategy. We need to understand, of course, the scoring. And as I mentioned, in the morning there are 120 questions and each one is worth 1 point. In the afternoon there are 60 questions and each is worth 2 points. So you have a total raw score of 240 points. And as has been, I guess, kind of the recent history, a passing score is approximately 50%. And that varies just because they're trying to make sure that there's an equality from test to test. And so there's sometimes a little adjustment if maybe the exam is a little more difficult than the previous one, then maybe it's 49%, or if it's a little harder, well, excuse me, a little harder, maybe 49%, a little easier, 51. So that might vary a little around 50%, but about 50%. So you're talking about wanting to get a total of, well, you don't want to get, aim for 50%. You want to aim for, of course, something higher, so that when you don't get 100% of the questions that you answer correctly, you still have enough to pass the exam. And then, in summary of kind of the test day, and that being the examination and everything, we talked about making sure that you come early so that you can get into the room and get your seat before the examination is to occur. The room might be hot or cold, so it's important to bring your layered clothing. The chairs, I have will be hard, but they may not. But prepare for that, and so kind of expect that it may be a pretty uncomfortable 8 hours, kind of trying to make yourself comfortable moving from side to side or whatever. So expect that as a possibility. There will be administrative paperwork at the beginning of the morning session and the afternoon session. Remember that you want to kind of sort through the problems by section, which means you want to have your strategy and kind of go through whatever has been your choice. If you want to go electric circuits and then digital systems or whatever, then that's kind of a pretty good way to go. In the previous years, we were also given information that would tell you, like, questions 1 through 10 would cover this topic, 11 through whatever. Right now, with the changes, I haven't seen anything yet that gives that breakdown. But still, a particular area once you see the questions, and so you would know that this is leading you to the electric circuits area or whatever. So you can still kind of manipulate it through it, but just not as easily as previously. And then work the easy ones first, as we said, and of course guess when you're unsure. Don't leave any of those questions unanswered, because you never know what you're going to need at the end. Okay, I've tried to cover, I guess, many topics related to preparing yourself for the examination, knowing the structure of it, therefore feeling comfortable when walking into the examination, hopefully giving you some tips on how to establish a strategy ahead of time and utilizing it, of course, in studying and then also in taking the examination. And I guess just wish you good luck.